So I ran across a headline a while ago um, that, although I didn't read the article at that time, it really stuck with me. The article was called "Are We Hardwired for Religion?" As someone who is both a religion nerd and a science nerd, I couldn't stop thinking about this question. And so I jumped headfirst down a rabbit hole of research to try to find the answer to this. And what I did find was super interesting. And so I wanted to share it with you all as this week's staff devotion. So, first of all, let's go over a little bit of science. Basically, from a scientific perspective, there are two ways to talk about being hardwired for religion. One is neurological, and the other is genetic. Neurotheologians, yeah, that's an actual scientific discipline, base their thinking on the fact that there are structures in our brain, in part of the limbic system, called God neurons. I couldn't make this stuff up, you guys. These God neurons fire off happy brain chemicals when we engage in spiritual pursuits like prayer, reading scripture, and even ritualized religious practices such as walking a labyrinth. Neurogeneticists, on the other hand, have found a gene. It's actually a spot on chromosome 10 called VMAT2 that, if it is altered even slightly by mutation or anything else, it will significantly lower a person's likelihood to engage in deep spiritual thinking and practice. So, both of these things, the God neuron and the God gene, are absolutely real. They've been extensively studied and have been proven to actually exist and function in the ways, I mean, roughly in the ways that I just described. But these are both bottom up explanations. They go from the absolute smallest thing. I mean, can you think of anything smaller than one allele on a single gene, or a little bit of electricity that fires in your brain? Um, these bottom up ideas all come from the bias that our behavior is largely determined by our biology. So, as Christians, we know that this science might be true, but we also know intuitively, I think, that there's more to it than that. If the scientific explanations are bottom up, there's also, in our faith, there's a top down theory, right? We know that God created people to be in relationship with God. Genesis 3:8 tells us about how God walked in the garden with Adam and Eve, and how God had an actual personal relationship with their human creations. Which begs the question, did God embed the desire to interact with the divine into our very physiology? Based on the science, it would seem so. But back to the headline, are we hardwired for religion? That's a more complicated question because religion isn't the same thing as faith. Religion is the method by which we interact with God. Remember how God visited Adam and Eve in the garden? Yeah, after the fall, he didn't do that anymore. God's covenant with Abraham reestablishes a relationship between God and humans, and Moses refines that relationship by sort of codifying a set of laws by which that relationship should function, right? Then, of course, Jesus comes along and restores that personal, direct relationship again by walking alongside human beings and living as one of them and interacting with them. So it's fairly tempting to look at the relationship that Jesus had with the world and say that that is what religion should be. That is the way that God desires for us to be in relationship with God. But it doesn't take long before that also gets really complicated. From the time of Peter and Paul meeting in Antioch, which is described in Galatians chapter 2, to the present day, when our very own United Methodist Church is considering splitting the denomination, there's been conflict within the Christian faith around how we interact with God. And this doesn't even begin to consider the other Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Islam, or the thousands of religions that have even more diverse scriptures and traditions. All of those folks have the same biology that we have, the same desire to have relationship with the divine. So, although it would seem that God did hardwire us with a desire for relationship, religion, the ways in which we express and or fulfill that desire, is a lot more fluid. So, I would ask the question, how are we doing? Both on a personal level and as a congregation, as the great cloud of witnesses that is described as Christians as a whole, even as a world with diverse beliefs and practices. How are we doing? Are we faithfully seeking to restore that personal relationship with God? And if so, are we defining the nature of that relationship through our denominational doctrines? Or are we trying to live into the relationship that God defined for us in the beginning? These are questions that science can't answer. And what's interesting about it is that religion can't answer them either. It's possible that the ability to understand that is just beyond our human comprehension, as so many things having to do with God are, right? But I'd like you to consider one thing. Could the answer to what our relationship with God should look like, could that still be inside us and just not have been discovered yet? Could that be something that biology and faith have to come together to define? The curiosity that is common to the disciplines of science and religion are not as different as they might seem. And I can't help but think that some of the bigger answers about our relationship with God, our relationships with each other, and our relationship to ourselves will take both of those disciplines coming together to truly understand.